office of President of the United States.
For democracy belongs to us all.
A government for our tomorrows.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
We gather because we have chosen hope over fear.
Because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you.
Meet this moment as the United States of America.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Election 2024, the post-political roundtable. I'm Sean Sullivan, the campaign editor here at The Washington Post. And today we continue our discussion about the 2024 election with some of the top journalists in our newsroom. Lots to talk about today. And first up, we have Toluse Olorunnipa, the White House bureau chief here at The Washington Post. Tolu, welcome to Election 2024.
It's great to be with you. A lot of things to talk about.
A lot of things to talk about, indeed. I want to start with something that's at the center of the news. It's a thing we talk about, right, in all of our political meetings week after week, it seems like, and that is the Israel-Gaza war. There's obviously a domestic component to that, which we can talk about in a little bit. But to start with, President Biden's top diplomat, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is in the Middle East. He's traveling abroad. Can you talk a little bit about what he is hoping to accomplish and what Biden and the Biden administration is hoping to accomplish right now with his travels and with this trip?
Yeah, Secretary Blinken has been back and forth to the Middle East multiple times since October 7th. This is the closest that they've been so far to getting a deal. They are trying to get the hostages released, still dozens, potentially more than 100 hostages that are still alive in Israel that need to be released, including a handful of Americans, and also a ceasefire. You've seen across college campuses and across parts of the Democratic base, people calling for a ceasefire, putting a lot of pressure on President Biden to get a ceasefire because of the humanitarian toll in Gaza. And so the goal for Secretary Blinken is to get hostages released by Hamas, the militant group that is holding those hostages, while also convincing Israel to agree to a ceasefire, at least for a temporary period of time, to allow more humanitarian aid to get in, to allow those hostages to get out, and to allow President Biden to face less pressure than what he's been facing over the past several weeks as colleges have erupted and protests have faced him everywhere he's gone because of the humanitarian toll in Gaza, where so many people have been killed, so many civilians have been killed by Israeli strikes, and the military campaign has gone against Hamas, but also taken a lot of civilian casualties as part of that campaign. And so that's Blinken's goal. It seems like he's getting close, but that goal, that target has been very elusive over the past several months as they haven't been able to get a deal yet, but they are the closest that they've been in several weeks, and they are optimistic that they will be able to get that deal and potentially release some of the pressure, political pressure, that President Biden is under because of the situation in Gaza.
Yeah, pressure does seem like the word of the hour right now, right, Tolu? Politically, policy-wise, does it feel like this administration right now has more influence over what Israel decides to do, less influence as compared to last fall, just given how things have changed, how this administration's posture has changed, how a lot of the world and a lot of people in this country have shifted in their views of this war? Does it feel like there's a shift in leverage at all here right now in terms of the U.S.'s ability to influence Israel's actions?
That's a really good question, Sean. I mean, we have our domestic politics here, but the Israelis have their own domestic politics, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's facing a lot of pressure himself over the war in Gaza, over whether or not he's doing the right thing. And so, yes, the U.S. continues to be Israel's largest supporter, the largest supporter in terms of financial support and military support. But at the same time, Prime Minister Netanyahu has to listen to his constituents, he has to listen to his war cabinet, and he has to listen to his coalition, which includes some far-right members that don't agree with President Biden's approach and don't want Prime Minister Netanyahu to be listening to the U.S. president. And, there is a sense that President Biden, who visited Israel shortly after the attack on October 7th, had a lot of support among the Israeli people. But since then, he has been more critical of Israel's military campaign. He's talked about potentially conditioning U.S. aid if Israel didn't allow more humanitarian aid to get to Gaza. He's talked about indiscriminate bombing by the Israelis and used a number of different phrases that have not landed well with the Israeli government and with some of the Israeli people. And as a result, he has less leverage with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he's also an incumbent that is facing a very tough political environment. There's always the question of whether or not President Biden will be the president in 6 months, or after the election later this year, whether or not he will be the person that the Israelis are looking to negotiate, or whether it will be Donald Trump when we get to November. And so he is starting to lose some of his leverage. He is starting to lose some of his influence. And we have seen a shift in the political dynamics based on the internal politics in Israel, as well as the internal domestic politics that we have here in the U.S. And it remains to be seen how all of that is going to play out over the next several months.
Yeah, I guess that's a really good reminder that this election this year is not just affecting what happens here and how people think about Trump versus Biden, but it's also potentially affecting how other world leaders conduct themselves. You mentioned, Tolu, the domestic political implications for President Biden here. So I wanted to turn to that and hear sort of what you're finding in your reporting. I mean, we've seen these campus protests escalate in the last few days at Columbia, at UCLA. We heard from the president himself earlier today weighing in on the protests themselves. What is the overall sort of Biden administration, Biden White House, Biden campaign thinking and strategy about how to deal with these protests, how to talk about them or not talk about them in some cases?
Yeah, that's another good question. Biden and his aides have been dealing with these protests long before they were part of the, sort of public consciousness, long before they erupted across college campuses. Because everywhere Biden traveled, as far back as November of last year, even when he was on his Thanksgiving holiday, he would run into protesters, pro-Palestine protesters that were really incensed by his support for Israel and really calling on him to make a change. And we've seen that protest movement blossom and grow and now erupt across college campuses to the point that it's leading the news. It's being covered live across the country. And now we saw President Biden really feel like he had to speak out. His approach in the past had been to sort of ignore the protesters, sometimes engage with them, but not really take them on, say that he was doing what he could to support Israel, but also make sure that he was providing aid and humanitarian support for the Palestinians that are caught up in this war. But now he's really being forced to make comments about what's happening across the country. And we saw, as he made his speech earlier today at the White House, that he is trying to speak to the various constituencies that are watching this very closely. He's saying that people have the right to protest, but what we're seeing across college campuses is not appropriate. The fact that college students are taking over buildings, the fact that anti-Semitism is being embraced in some of these protests, he spoke out very forcefully against those things, while also trying to say that he supported the right of people to make their voices heard, that he understood the plight of the Palestinians that are suffering under this war. And so he's in a little bit of a political bind because when you make a statement that tries to appeal to different parts of the electorate, sometimes it can come across as if you are not taking a stand or that you are not addressing an issue with moral clarity. But that is the challenge that he faces, how to continue to support Israel while also showing the support for the Palestinians that are suffering, and while also showing support for people who have their First Amendment rights to protest, while also showing support for college students and other people who have the right to go to college and not feel like they are, in the midst of an embattled space and having, commencements canceled and having classes canceled. And so that broader sense of chaos, which President Biden is facing a lot of criticism from his political opponents over that. He has a lot of pressure on him to calm that chaos down, to address it, and to try to bring back a sense of normalcy, not only across college campuses, but across the country where these protests are taking place.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Tolu, that you bring up, the chaos question, the normalcy question. I remember covering the 2020 campaign and Biden sort of campaigning on this promise of restoring normalcy across the country. You see Republicans left and right, saying, well, look at the country right now, look at the world right now, and look at, all of these chaotic events. And so I guess my question is, how much of a political liability does it seem right now, the idea of chaos, both at home and abroad is for Biden, for his campaign, and how are they thinking about that?
Yeah, they are trying to sort of limit the liability that they face over this issue of chaos, because going into this election, they always thought that they'd be able to brand former President Trump as the chaos agent, as a person who's facing, criminal charges in various jurisdictions across the country, as the person who makes all of these outlandish and sometimes extreme statements. But President Trump has tried to turn that around by saying that the world is on fire under Biden, that Biden is the one who's a threat to democracy, and really tried to neutralize that attack line against him by saying that look at the world, look at the economy, look at the destabilization of different hotspots across the globe, and so it is a major liability for President Biden. They are hoping in the Democratic Party and in the president's campaign that they will be able to tamp down this sense of unrest before we get to November, before we get to the conventions this summer and into the fall. They're hoping that the world stage and domestically that things will be much more calm, that college students will go home, and there will be some kind of deal between Israel and Hamas over the hostages and over a ceasefire, and even potentially between Saudi Arabia and Israel, so that there would be a sense of calm across the globe by the time we're getting into the election period. Now, that may be wishful thinking, but that is their goal. Their hope is to be able to turn that chaos attack line back against former President Trump, talk about the fact that he is facing all of these charges, he's spending all of this time in a courtroom, and that he's, every time that he goes out and speaks and holds a rally, saying things about authoritarianism, about what he would do as president, that would cause people to think and remember the chaos that we saw during his first term. And so that's the goal of the Biden campaign. Whether or not they're able to achieve that on a policy matter, that remains to be seen, and that is their big task over the next several months.
Yeah, it's a really enormous task. Last thing I wanted to ask you, Tolu, we've got a viewer question on this topic that we've been talking about a lot over the past few minutes here. Rosalind Metzger from Pennsylvania asks us, why aren't we hearing more from Biden and Harris regarding the student protests? Now, this question was submitted before we heard from President Biden today, who we talked about, has weighed in at length. But real quick, Tolu, what are your sort of thoughts on kind of this, how Biden and Harris have navigated this? Is this a fair question to ask? Have they been relatively muted until now about the protests themselves?
Yeah, I think this question is one of the reasons President Biden spoke out today, in part because people had been asking, where is the president, as we're seeing all of these campuses erupt into violence and chaos. And so he did feel compelled to address this in a more full-throated way. It was something that would have to happen, in part because everyone else is talking about it. Republicans are talking about it. College students and parts of the Democratic base are talking about it and asking where the president stands. And so he had been a bit muted going into this week. But as we've seen, violent clashes between police and protesters, violent clashes between pro-Israel protesters and pro-Palestinian protesters, we've really seen violence erupt across the country in ways that force the president to speak out in a more direct way. And I think we are likely to hear more from him in the weeks ahead, because this is something that you can't ignore. This is not something that's going to go away on its own. This is a major liability for him, and I expect him to be much more direct as we go forward in addressing this and talking about it, because it is going to continue to be a challenge for him unless he is seen as sort of taking the helm and being a direct, in charge kind of president as the country grapples with these very thorny political issues.
Lots to watch at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Tolu, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have to leave it right there, but don't be a stranger. Come back on the program, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about on this issue and many others in the weeks to come.
For sure.
Okay, I want to continue the program now with two other great journalists, national politics reporter Isaac Arnsdorf and Perry Stein, who covers the Justice Department for us. They've both been covering the Trump trial, which we're going to get into here momentarily. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so before we start talking about Trump and the Trump trials, we've got a trivia question. which I want to read right now. You'll have some time to think about it and then answer it at the end. Don't spoil it if you know it off the bat. But here's our trivia question for this week. 13 years ago this week, a geopolitical event occurred that the sitting U.S. president called, quote, most significant achievement. What happened? So you have to do the math, do, minus 13 years, do a little arithmetic. Don't answer it yet. We'll come back to this question at the end of the segment, and I'll repeat it again to give you guys another crack at it. Okay, Isaac, let's start with you. You've been covering the Trump campaign pretty closely. You had a great story this week about a comparison of sorts that former President Trump was drawing between the campus protests, which we were talking about with Tolu in the previous segment, and the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Can you unpack a little bit about what we heard from former President Trump this week?
Well, what he was saying was that he wondered if the student protesters would get punished in a similar way to how Capitol rioters have been prosecuted. And he meant that sarcastically, that he said he didn't expect that to happen. And the point he was trying to make was driving this argument that the legal system has been weaponized against conservatives, that it treats conservatives differently, and tying that back to himself speaking in a courthouse hallway where he is on trial in one of the 4 criminal cases against him. But obviously, these two things are not the same. No one has died in the campus protests. There have been the police have deployed force and tear gas, but there is no way that is the same as the mob of Trump supporters that ransacked the Capitol and led to multiple deaths on January 6th.
Yeah, and he also, Isaac, talked about something he's weighed in on before, which you also reported on, which is the notion of pardoning people who have been convicted in connection with crimes on January 6th. He made a more expansive sort of declaration in an interview that was published this week. Can you talk a little bit about why he continues to bring this up, how it's been received, and what the implications are potentially in a second term?
Yeah, so what he said in the Time magazine interview that was published on Tuesday was that he would consider pardoning all of the January 6th defendants. And previously, he has been less specific about just saying that he would pardon them, but to say that he would consider every last one of them. And obviously, that is a wide range of misdemeanors for nonviolent offenses of just being inside the Capitol, unauthorized entry, versus people who were convicted of attacking police officers and seditious conspiracy. But for Trump, again, he has continued to escalate his identification of himself with the January 6th defendants. And again, what that's about is situating himself as a criminal defendant along with them to make this idea that it's not just him that's on trial, it's his entire movement. It's not just the government coming after him, but coming after all of his voters as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, speaking of being a criminal defendant, Perry, I want to turn to you. You've been covering the Trump criminal trial in New York for us. Can you talk a little bit about what has stuck out to you as the most notable moments or revelations? And has there been anything surprising, any big shockers so far in what we've heard in terms of testimony, in terms of what we've heard from the lawyers and the judge? How would you sort of size this all up?
Definitely. So we haven't had like the big name witnesses that I think most people following this would have heard of. So we haven't had Michael Cohen yet. We haven't had Stormy Daniels, both of whom are expected to take the witness stand. But what we have had is people involved in this tabloid journalism world, which, we really got an inside view of kind of how these hush money payments work, how people sought out these Stormy Daniels and these Karen McDougal stories, and they put a price on them and they killed them, those stories, so that they would not come out. This is all allegedly, obviously, before the 2016 election. So what's really, I think, one key moment that really stuck out to me, right? None of this is inherently illegal, but what they have to do in this case is connect it to the idea that these payments and this hush money arrangement was used to influence as part of this 2016 election. So, I mean, one thing I was surprised about, right, there's not a ton of new splashy news in this coming out of this testimony. We heard a lot of it before, but what I thought was interesting is David Pecker he is the head of the company that publishes the National Enquirer, and this is the magazine that, David Pecker laid out in coordination with the campaign, according to his testimony. They really had this deal to, seek out any negative stories about Trump. And instead of publishing them, they made sure that no one published them. And they also sought out stories of his rivals so that they could make his political rivals look bad. And at one point, the prosecutors asked David Pecker, did you know that these were being used in regards to the election? Did you know that by doing these payments, you were violating election law? And he said, yes, I did. That he knew that if they were being used to influence the election, that he knew that would be a violation of election law. So that was pretty interesting to me to just show what people knew and didn't know, and that will be key to the prosecutor's case. That's part of it. They have to connect Trump to it, obviously, too.
Yeah. And Perry, the judge held Trump in contempt of court, fined him for violating a gag order. There's been a lot of attention paid to what Trump has been saying about the case, what he can say outside of the courtroom on social media, when he's giving these sort of impromptu press conferences, when he's talking at rallies. Can you sort of unpack for us what the significance of that ruling was and what that could mean moving forward for the rest of this case?
Yeah, so the Judge Merchan, said that Trump violated it 9 times. Now that's $9,000. I mean, that's chump change. That in and of itself, or for Trump it is, I should say, that in of itself is not a huge deal. But he did often also threaten him and reminded him that he could go to jail. Now, I think there's so many hypotheticals that would need to happen before, that extreme scenario comes to be. But I think it's a reminder to Trump, too, that he is a criminal defendant. He may be a political candidate, but he cannot say whatever he wants. And, he's risking the judge being really not happy with him. And this judge is, calling the shots in this trial. So, I don't think the financial, hit on Trump is what's a big deal here. But again, you see, you have Trump's attorney saying he knows what the gag order is and, he's aware of it and we don't think he's crossing the line. And to me, that suggests that Trump is, at least to some degree, I can't speak to what he wants the outcome of this or not to be in regards to what he's saying and how the judge perceives it. But it is controlling, at least, or dictating, I should say, what he is able to say and not able to say on the campaign trail. And obviously, there is a risk of jail time.
Yes, a pretty significant one, it seems, right now. Isaac, you were on the trail with Donald Trump in Wisconsin yesterday. There was no court. There was no trial session. This is the one day during the week, Wednesday, that they are not in session. Can you talk a little bit about what you found? What was the mood among Trump supporters you talked to? And what did we hear from the former president, who hasn't had a chance to get out on the trail recently and do a rally like this? I think the last one he was going to try to do was in North Carolina. It was canceled by weather. So I think this was the first one that he did since the trial has started, right?
Yeah, this was his first time on the trail since the trial started, but there was that one that was canceled due to weather, and then it's not his first day off. It's just the first time that they did a rally, although he was certainly complaining about how the court schedule limits his ability to be campaigning as much as he likes. And really what he was saying about the trial there was a double header. There was a speech in Wisconsin and in Michigan, and it was really almost exactly the same as what he says in the hallway going in and out of the courtroom. But obviously the setting is very different. And so instead of being in this very dreary hallway, and being in this trial, which according to our reporting, he's really struggling to get through in terms of having to sit there for these long proceedings, not having his phone, not being able to play golf every day like he's used to, and that really gets at him. That really gets at his spirits. And you could see how he was really feeding off the energy of the crowd, of being met by thousands of cheering fans who were hanging on his every word and chanting his name and clapping and laughing at his jokes and booing at his opponents, and so he was really energized by that, and kind of taking the opportunity to sort of blow off steam and taking his time to say all the things that he wanted to say, even while complaining that he was limited in what he could say.
Indeed. And Isaac, you saw and reported up close a lot about how the criminal jeopardy and the legal problems that Trump faces were beneficial politically to him in the primary in a bunch of different places. I think that was pretty clear. But now that we are sort of effectively, at least in the general election phase, how does that change things, and how could this potentially, hurt him now in this phase of the campaign?
I think it's really too soon to say. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that him personally and his advisors being busy with the trial rather than the campaign has been disruptive. But there's still so much trial left to go, and sometimes surprising things happen at trial. Obviously, a lot depends on the outcome, on the verdict, and then you are dealing with a totally different electorate. That again, you're right that it was clearly helpful to consolidate Republican support for Trump in the primary, but how it plays, either just being on trial or possibly even being convicted, how that plays with moderates and independents and swing voters, totally different. And polling about that hypothetical doesn't tend to be that predictive. You're really going to have to see how it turns out, how Trump messages it, and then how people perceive it.
And Perry, this New York case, it's not the only criminal case that Trump is facing. There are 3 others. Can you talk about any notable developments or things that we should watch in any of the other cases? There's obviously one in Georgia. There's a federal case. What, if anything, has been happening on those other fronts that's been notable in recent weeks?
Yeah, so obviously DC is one that we're thinking, when will that one happen? And we were waiting for the Supreme Court hearing on presidential immunity, right? That whole case is paused until the Supreme Court decides, answers this big question of how far does presidential immunity extend when it comes to criminal prosecution. They had those oral arguments last week in late April. And based on that, as talking to my colleague who's, covers the Supreme Court, what the takeaway there is that they will likely not agree with Trump, but they may do it in a way, meaning they'll say he can be prosecuted for these crimes related to January 6th, but they may do it in a way where the case actually kicks it back down to the appellate court. All of that is just to say is that would delay the case further. So we really don't have, I certainly don't, a good prediction as to when that case will go to trial. Florida, we don't have a trial date. It's on the books for May right now, but we know that's subject to change. It's been 2 months since Judge Eileen Cannon has had a hearing to determine when the case will go to trial. She hasn't ruled yet, and I'm watching that docket closely this week because we're expecting some incremental deadline rulings, incremental little filings. So nothing huge, but something worth keeping an eye out. All these little decisions in that Florida case will add up to when this case could possibly go to trial, since a case involving classified documents has so many other hurdles and deadlines that it has to go to when compared to your average case that does not involve such a big number of classified documents.
Yeah, a lot to watch on various fronts. Okay, Isaac and Perry, Final Jeopardy time has arrived. I would play the theme music if I had it handy, but I don't. But I want to see if either of you want to take a guess at our trivia question, which I will remind you and our viewers of right now. And that question is, 13 years ago this week, a geopolitical event occurred that the sitting U.S. president called a, quote, most significant achievement. Any guesses on what that achievement was from either of you?
I have one. Perry, do you want to go?
No, you can. I'll hand this one to Isaac.
I
Okay,
think
go
that
ahead.
was the night that the Celebrity Apprentice was interrupted by Barack Obama's announcement that the Navy SEALs had raided bin Laden's compound and killed Osama bin Laden.
Very good student of history, Isaac Arnsdorf. That is correct. On May 1st, 2011, a military raid led by 24 Navy SEALs in 2 helicopters tracked down and killed Osama bin Laden. And President Barack Obama, sitting President Obama at the time, spoke, I should say, to the American people that night. And let's take a listen to what he said.
For over 2 decades, bin Laden has been al-Qaeda's leader and symbol, and has continued to plot attacks against our country and our friends and allies. The death of bin Laden marks the most significant achievement to date in our nation's effort to defeat al-Qaeda. Yet his death does not mark the end of our effort. There's no doubt that al-Qaeda will continue to pursue attacks against us.
13 years ago this week, and Isaac, you are the big winner. The prize remains to be determined, but great guesswork there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I really appreciate both of you being on the program. Isaac, Perry, covering the Trump campaign and the trials really, really closely. And so do not be a stranger. I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about between now and November, potentially beyond on both of these fronts.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And thanks to all of you for watching. And to stay up to date on Donald Trump's criminal cases with a weekly rundown of the latest developments, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter. Just go to washingtonpost.com/newsletters/the-Trump-trials. And you can stay up to date with all of that. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Sean Sullivan, and we'll talk to you again next time.